He was ashamed of her skin color and imagined her as his maid. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from. Victor had always prided himself on the life he had built from scratch. Born into a modest, working-class family in the outskirts of a dull industrial town, he had grown up with a fierce determination to escape. The childhood photographs, grainy, sun-bleached snapshots of brick walls and hand-me-down clothes, were tucked away in a dusty box in the back of his closet. He hadn't looked at them in years. They reminded him of everything he had run from, everything he now disdained. In the gleaming high-rise buildings of the city center, he had rebranded himself. Victor wore tailored suits, kept his blonde hair meticulously styled, and rarely left the apartment without the polished air of importance. His life was a performance, curated, polished, controlled. He had become a senior strategy consultant in one of the most prestigious global corporations operating in the city, an industry that worshipped perfection, efficiency, and above all, image. Every morning, he entered his office tower as though stepping onto a stage. Co-workers smiled, impressed by his cool confidence, his steady rise through the ranks, his quick wit. At the weekly executive meetings, his presentations were sharp, his forecasts precise. He spoke the language of metrics, strategy, innovation. He was admired, envied, even feared by some. To outsiders, his life was enviable. And yet, beneath the marble floors and designer watches, something deeply fragile clung to him. At home, Victor lived in a sleek, minimalist apartment with clean lines and curated furniture. Every object had its place. Every surface was spotless. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It was also quiet, too quiet. The silence settled in the air like a layer of dust he couldn't see but always felt. Amara was the only softness in that rigid world. She had come into his life during graduate school, when Victor was still rough around the edges, still working 2 jobs and scribbling notes in the margins of borrowed textbooks. She was radiant in her intelligence, warm in her presence, with skin the color of rich coffee and a voice that could make any room feel like home. She was the daughter of a diplomat from a West African country, studying international law. Their connection had been instant, passionate, and deeply sincere. Amara, with her deep sense of kindness and steady strength, had been the first person to see through Victor's ambition and into the boy who had grown up with second-hand shoes and too little food. She had loved him gently, fully, without reservation. He, in turn, had clung to her like an anchor, marveled at her laughter, depended on her quiet certainty in times of doubt. They had married in a small ceremony without much fanfare, sharing whispered vows in a garden with only a handful of friends present. But time had changed Victor. With each promotion, with each new level of success, something inside him tightened. As his circle expanded into boardrooms and rooftop bars, as his colleagues spoke of private schools, curated marriages, and vacations in Santorini, Amara began to feel like a secret he had to manage. Not because of who she was as a person — she was brilliant, articulate, and accomplished — but because of what she represented in their world of glossy sameness. She didn't look like the other wives. She didn't dress in European designer labels, didn't lighten her skin or hide her accent. She was proud of her identity, of her heritage, of the culture that shaped her. And Victor, deep down, had started to resent that. He had begun to feel the weight of their difference, not within the intimacy of their home, but in the eyes of others, when their gazes lingered too long, when their smiles stiffened just slightly, when questions about her background were wrapped in casual curiosity but laced with judgment. He never admitted it to himself, not directly, but his avoidance spoke volumes. Over time, he stopped inviting her to events. He said they were too formal, too small, or that clients would be there and it would be awkward. Amara, patient and understanding, accepted these excuses at first. She told herself he was under pressure, that he needed to focus, that he was trying to protect her from the cruelty of his world. In truth, Victor was protecting himself from discomfort, from questions, from being seen differently. He had built a reputation as a refined, modern man. And in his twisted logic, Amara's presence, her very skin, risked undoing that image. He had even gone so far as to fabricate a backstory about her to some colleagues, vague mentions of a foreign girlfriend working in fashion, constantly flying between Paris and New York. It was easier than saying his wife was a woman of deep substance and African descent. He never thought about the implications of these lies. He only thought about survival, social, professional, and aesthetic. As long as Amara stayed in the background, as long as she didn't appear in photographs or attend events, his perfect image remained intact. He never noticed how his withdrawal chipped away at her, how each exclusion left her a little more hollow, how her eyes lingered on the untouched earrings in her jewelry box or the unworn silk blouse she had bought for a special occasion that never came. The real blow came on a Thursday afternoon in the early spring when an email from corporate communications arrived in his inbox. It was addressed to all senior-level employees. Annual Global Strategy Gala, attendance with spouse or partner required. Victor read the message twice, his stomach tightening with each word. Attendance was non-negotiable. The company wanted to showcase its executive team in a new promotional campaign. There would be photographs, interviews, press coverage, and they wanted partners there to highlight the family values and diversity of our leadership. It was supposed to be an inclusive gesture. For Victor, it was a trap. He stared at the screen, heart pounding, palms sweating. There was no way out. He couldn't skip the event without raising questions. He couldn't lie. And he shouldn't bring Amara, not as his wife, not as the woman who didn't fit the fantasy he had constructed. That night, he sat in the living room while Amara prepared dinner in the kitchen, her movements familiar and comforting. She asked about his day, smiling as she stirred the pot, humming softly under her breath. And as he watched her from the couch, Victor felt the first twinge of something ugly. Shame. Not of her, of himself. But rather than face it, he buried it, and began to formulate a plan. He would bring her to the gala, but he would introduce her not as his wife, but as his assistant. It was, in his mind, a temporary fiction. Just one night. One performance. Then everything could go back to normal. He rehearsed how he would explain it to her, how he would frame it as a necessity, a formality, something the company expected. He told himself she would understand, that she wouldn't mind, that it wouldn't hurt her. But even as he told himself these things, Victor couldn't ignore the chill that settled in his chest. Because deep down, beneath all his rationalizations and justifications, he knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew that once the line was crossed, nothing between them would ever be the same again. Still, he said nothing that night. Instead, he complimented her cooking. He asked her about her day. He kissed her forehead with practiced ease. And as she smiled and leaned into his embrace, he wondered how long it would take before that smile disappeared forever. In the days that followed the announcement of the gala, Victor became increasingly preoccupied. His calm exterior remained mostly intact. He attended meetings, gave sharp comments during strategic briefings, and even managed to land a new client for the firm. But beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. The thought of the upcoming event lingered in the back of his mind like a constant hum, refusing to be silenced. Every time he passed a mirror in the hallway or caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window, his thoughts would spiral again. What would they think when they saw her? How could he spin this? He knew the kind of people who would attend the gala. Senior executives with their manicured wives and husbands, all dressed in sleek, tailored clothing, speaking the same refined language of success and subtle self-importance. Partners who knew which fork to use for the salad and could discuss global politics over champagne. Amara, for all her warmth, intelligence, and elegance, did not belong to that world. She was not molded by its expectations, nor did she try to be. That had once been part of her charm, her authenticity, her indifference to pretense. But now, to Victor, it had become a liability. He remembered a moment from a year ago. At a smaller work event, he had begged her not to attend. She had insisted on coming, saying she wanted to support him. He had finally relented, but spent the entire evening on edge. He remembered how she had gently corrected a senior partner who mispronounced the name of a West African country, how she had spoken passionately about immigration policies during a casual conversation. It was innocent, articulate, even impressive, but Victor had noticed the way people looked at her afterward, as though she had said too much, been too visible, taken up too much space. Now, faced with a high-profile gala where the press would be present, the idea of introducing her as his wife made something tighten in his chest. He told himself it wasn't about race. He told himself it was about optics, about control, about his future. He had worked too hard, come too far. One wrong impression could unbalance everything. In that fragile framework he had constructed, one built on perception, polish, and illusion, Amara was the unpredictable element he couldn't afford. One evening, as the rain whispered against the windows and the city lights flickered like distant stars, Victor sat alone at the kitchen table. His laptop lay open, the invitation to the gala still on the screen. He stared at it for a long time, his fingers unmoving on the keys. He had to make a decision. The only way he could take her without risking everything was to shape the narrative himself. And so, slowly, methodically, he began constructing the lie. He would tell his colleagues that Amara was his personal assistant. She would attend to help him manage the logistics of the evening, notes, correspondence, coordination. He would introduce her as someone efficient and professional, there to ensure everything ran smoothly. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. No one would question it. And most importantly, it would protect his image. The next morning, over breakfast, Victor carefully broached the subject. He chose his words with surgical precision, softening the edges of the lie, wrapping it in concern and professionalism. He explained that the company had strict protocols for the event, that public perception was crucial, and that there had been confusion in the past with spouses speaking out of turn or misrepresenting private matters. He said it would be simpler if they presented her as his assistant, just for the evening. No harm, just a formality. Amara listened in silence, her expression unreadable. She stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Victor watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. Finally, she nodded. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. She said she understood. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was shallow. He could sense the heaviness behind her words, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly. She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. That silence unnerved him more than if she had raised her voice. But he ignored the discomfort and moved on, diving into a monologue about how they'd plan her outfit to fit the assistant role, how he'd handle the introductions, how it was just for one night. Amara smiled faintly and said nothing more. After breakfast, she cleared the table, humming softly to herself. The sound reminded Victor of their early days together, of shared kitchens and late-night talks, of laughter and stories exchanged in bed. But that warmth felt distant now, like a song from another life. In the following days, Amara began preparing for the event with quiet diligence. She went shopping alone, choosing a simple black dress, modest, elegant, unassuming. She bought modest jewelry, polished her shoes, and booked a hair appointment. She asked Victor only once if the dress was appropriate. He glanced at it briefly and nodded. It was exactly what he wanted: professional, neutral, invisible. Victor, meanwhile, buried himself in rehearsals. He went over his introduction, practiced smiling at the right moments, strategized how to shift conversations away from anything personal. He even rehearsed a small chuckle for when someone inevitably asked if his assistant was single. Every detail was planned. The evening before the gala, Amara sat by the window with a book on her lap. She wasn't reading. Her gaze was distant, her posture tense. Victor noticed her from across the room and hesitated. For a brief moment, he considered crossing over, taking her hand and saying something honest. But instead, he asked if she was ready for tomorrow. She nodded. That night, as they lay in bed side by side, the space between them felt wider than ever. The quiet was not peaceful, it was brittle. Amara lay awake long after Victor had drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her thoughts ran in circles, touching on memories, dreams, and quiet realizations. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the home she had left behind, the career path she had turned away from, the parts of herself she had softened to fit into his world. And now, to be hidden, renamed, recast, it hurt more than she could say. But even in that moment, she tried to understand him. She told herself he was afraid, that the world had taught him to fear judgment, that he didn't know better. She reminded herself of his childhood stories, of how hard he had worked to be accepted. Still, she couldn't ignore the ache in her chest. She couldn't ignore how small she felt in the life they had built together. Victor slept soundly, oblivious to her thoughts. He dreamed of the gala, of smiles and applause, of being congratulated on his poise and presence. He didn't dream of Amara. She had already been edited out. When morning came, they moved through their routine as if nothing had changed. He adjusted his cufflinks while she tied her hair back. He checked his calendar while she applied a touch of lipstick. When they finally stood side by side in the mirror before leaving, he barely looked at her. She, however, looked at him for a long time. She searched his face for something: regret, love, hesitation, but found only focus. As they stepped into the waiting car and the city lights stretched before them, Amara pressed her hands together in her lap and whispered a silent prayer, not for the night ahead, but for the strength to face it with dignity. Victor checked his reflection in the tinted window, adjusted his tie, and smiled. He was ready. But neither of them knew that this night would mark the beginning of the end. That beneath the layers of performance and compromise, something was cracking, quietly and irrevocably. And once it broke, no amount of silence or strategy would be enough to hold it together again. The evening air hung with the scent of spring rain, faint but lingering, as the black car slid through the wet streets of the city. The skyline shimmered with light, each building aglow like a monument to wealth and success. Inside the vehicle, the silence between Victor and Amara was thick, impenetrable. He sat with his back straight, his eyes on his phone, fingers tapping out last-minute confirmations. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, the new black dress hugging her figure with quiet dignity. Neither of them spoke. The ride to the gala venue was not long, but every passing minute deepened the gulf between them. Amara occasionally glanced out the window, watching the blur of pedestrians and traffic lights, the distant reflections of restaurants and store displays. She remembered walking these same streets years ago, hand in hand with Victor, laughing about something trivial, dreaming aloud about the future. That version of them felt far away now, like a memory from another life. The car pulled up to a towering hotel adorned with golden uplights and banners bearing the company's logo. The entrance buzzed with guests arriving, valets whisking away cars, staff greeting attendees with polished smiles. A long crimson carpet stretched towards the grand glass doors. It was theatrical, as expected, deliberately ostentatious, meant to impress. Victor stepped out first, adjusting his suit jacket with mechanical precision. He glanced back at Amara, who stepped out carefully, smoothing the folds of her dress. For a moment, their eyes met. He nodded once, his expression unreadable, and then began walking. She followed. Inside, the lobby was transformed into a gallery of extravagance. Glittering chandeliers bathed the marble floor in golden light. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. An elegant string quartet played softly near the grand staircase, their music threading through the air like silk. The guests were already assembling in clusters, laughter and polite chatter filling the vast space. Victor was immediately greeted by colleagues and executives. They shook his hand, clapped him on the back, complimented his tie, and mentioned the latest figures from his department. He smiled, engaged, slipping seamlessly into the role he had spent years perfecting. His voice was steady, charming. His body language was confident. He was every inch the man they expected him to be. Amara stood a step behind him, quiet and observant. He had introduced her quickly, almost casually. "This is Amara, my assistant for the evening. She's helping coordinate some logistics." A few polite nods followed, though she caught the flicker of curiosity in one woman's eyes, the brief hesitation before turning away. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, the crowd thickened. Tables were arranged in perfect symmetry, each adorned with crystal glasses, flower arrangements, and embossed name cards. A stage was set near the front with a sleek podium and large screens displaying the company's logo interspersed with promotional videos. The atmosphere was charged with energy. Success hung in the air like perfume. Amara followed Victor as he made his rounds, stopping to speak with one executive, then another. She remained silent unless addressed, smiling politely, declining drinks. When she excused herself to retrieve a glass of sparkling water, he didn't even glance her way. He was engrossed in a discussion about market expansion in Southeast Asia, gesturing with controlled enthusiasm. At the bar, the bartender nodded respectfully and served her drink without question. She sipped slowly, her eyes scanning the room. Most of the other partners were dressed in designer gowns, their makeup impeccable, their laughter choreographed. She felt the looks, some curious, some indifferent, some skeptical. A few people smiled at her and she returned the gesture, but the divide was tangible. She watched Victor from across the room. He stood in a circle of peers, his posture relaxed but alert, his laugh sharp and timed. He was in his element, yet not once had he looked her way. Not once had he checked to see how she was doing. It wasn't just the distance that hurt. It was the invisibility. A young woman approached her at one point, perhaps another assistant, judging by her simpler attire. They exchanged brief pleasantries before the woman, clearly more comfortable in the environment, was summoned back by her employer. Amara was left standing alone once more. Back near the center of the ballroom, Victor was asked about his supposed fiancée. Someone mentioned that they had heard she was a model based in Paris. Victor nodded, spun the same story he had rehearsed countless times, that she was launching a new collection in Europe and had sent Amara in her place generously, so she wouldn't miss the evening. "It's her first time seeing an event like this," he added, laughing lightly. "I thought I'd give her a glimpse of the world she's been working so hard to support behind the scenes." The group chuckled, accepting the narrative without question. No one doubted him. They trusted his polish, his narrative control. After all, Victor had never given them a reason not to. Amara returned to the edge of the crowd and stood quietly, trying to make sense of her place in the room. Her eyes traced the golden lights reflected in the polished floors, the subtle movement of dresses and tailored suits. She felt like a ghost, present but unseen, a prop in someone else's performance. She wandered toward the gallery hallway just beyond the main ballroom. There, the noise faded slightly, replaced by the quiet echo of footsteps and distant music. Paintings adorned the walls, abstract images of progress, motion, innovation. Beneath one large piece she paused. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass frame, elegant, composed, and entirely alone. She didn't know how long she stood there before Victor appeared beside her, his expression tight. "Everything okay?" he asked, not with concern, but with caution. She nodded, turning from the painting. "Yes." "Come back in," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Dinner's about to be served." She followed him again, as she always had, back into the brightly lit room. They were seated at a table near the front, surrounded by other senior executives and their partners. Amara kept her posture straight, her hands resting gently on her lap, her smile soft but guarded. Throughout dinner, Victor was fully engaged. He led conversations, offered witty remarks, discussed recent market trends with confidence. Occasionally, he gestured toward Amara when someone asked about her role, always keeping the explanation short. She responded politely, her voice calm, her answers rehearsed in her mind. She was everything he had asked her to be, professional, unobtrusive, composed. But inside, her heart was unraveling. Every polite lie he told about her deepened the fracture she had been trying to ignore. Every time he referred to her as an assistant, as someone temporary, someone peripheral, something inside her dimmed. She remembered their wedding vows, spoken softly beneath a tree in a sunlit garden. She remembered the way he had once looked at her, with wonder, with love. And now, he didn't even see her. As the speeches began and the CEO took the stage to toast the company's continued success, Amara looked around the room one last time. She took in the crystal glasses, the embroidered napkins, the false laughter, and the glassy smiles. She saw the world Victor had chased, the one he had traded so much to be part of. She realized, finally and fully, that in his pursuit of perfection, he had erased her. And yet, she stayed. She smiled when the toast ended. She clapped when others clapped. She said thank you to the waiter who cleared her plate. She nodded politely to the woman seated beside her who complimented her posture. She stayed until the end of the speeches, until the music swelled again and the lights dimmed for dancing. She stood beside Victor when a photographer passed by and forced herself to keep smiling when the camera flashed. She let him place a hand lightly on her shoulder for appearances. And all the while, her mind was quietly gathering itself. She was cataloging the details, imprinting the betrayal. Not for confrontation, not for drama, but for the moment she would finally walk away. The music continued to float through the grand ballroom, elegant and refined, as couples moved onto the polished dance floor in graceful pairs. Soft lighting cast a golden glow over the guests, and the air carried the scent of wine, perfume, and luxury. Victor remained among his peers, mingling with the effortless charm of someone who knew how to belong. Amara stood silently near the edge of the crowd, her presence as carefully placed as the centerpieces that adorned each table, present, decorative, unnoticed. She had tried, truly tried, to make this night matter in some way, to believe that by being here, by enduring the fiction, she could somehow reach him, that perhaps once the performance was over, he might look at her, not as a role or a responsibility, but as a woman he had once chosen. But that moment never came. Each minute passed like a quiet erosion, wearing down the last of her illusions. Victor approached her briefly, his smile tight, his voice low and clipped. "Why don't you go get us some drinks?" he said, not unkindly, but with the habitual tone of command. She nodded and walked toward the bar, not because she was thirsty, not because she wanted to comply, but because she needed the distance. As she waited for the bartender to fill the glasses, she heard laughter nearby, sharp, bright, the sound of practiced seduction. She turned her head slightly and saw her husband standing with a woman in a deep emerald gown. The woman's hand rested lightly on Victor's arm as she leaned closer, speaking in low tones meant for intimacy. Amara couldn't hear the words, but she could see everything in their body language, the ease, the familiarity, the unspoken message exchanged in every gesture. She returned her gaze to the bar and waited. When the drinks were ready, she turned and began walking back through the crowd, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor. But then she heard her name not spoken but referenced. She stopped without thinking, just behind a tall floral arrangement. The voices were close, and she recognized Victor's without effort. The woman laughed again, a melodious sound, as if she were amused by a private joke. "So, who's that woman you came in with?" she asked lightly. "The one in black, hovering near the walls all evening." Victor's response came after a brief pause, and Amara could hear the smile in his voice even before he spoke. "Oh, her?" he said, and then chuckled. "That's just my housekeeper. She's been with me for years. I figured, why not let her see how the other half lives for a night?" The woman gasped, laughed again, and responded with something Amara didn't catch. Her ears were filled with a dull roar, like the sound of blood rushing too fast. Her hands tightened around the glasses, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Housekeeper? Just a housekeeper. Not a wife, not a partner. Not a woman who had crossed oceans for him. Not a woman who had once believed in a future with him so completely that she had risked everything to build it by his side. She turned slowly and walked back toward the ballroom, no longer certain of her steps. Her vision blurred at the edges. When she reached the table where they had been seated, she placed the drinks down gently and sat, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the gala unfolded in glittering detail. Music, conversation, laughter. No one noticed the woman in black sitting in silence. She waited, not because she was unsure, but because she knew the moment had to matter. Eventually, Victor returned, the woman in the emerald gown no longer at his side. He smiled absently at Amara and picked up one of the glasses. "Perfect," he said. "Thanks." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes, usually warm and expressive, were now unreadable. He didn't notice. As another announcement rang out from the stage, calling attention to a brief intermission before the awards, Amara rose from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, composed. She walked toward the stage, her dress rustling softly with each step. At first, no one paid attention, but then someone turned to look, then another. By the time she reached the microphone, a hush had settled over the room. She stood in the center of the stage, under the full glare of the lights, her figure framed against the company's logo projected behind her. Her heart beat steadily, but she felt strangely detached from it. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Good evening," she began, and the room responded with a ripple of polite curiosity. "I apologize for interrupting. I know this is a night meant for celebration and recognition. I won't take much of your time." Victor had frozen at the table. A fork hung suspended in his hand, his face drained of color. "I just wanted to offer a small clarification," Amara continued. "Some of you may have met me tonight and been told that I'm an assistant, or perhaps a housekeeper, or someone just passing through." She paused. The silence deepened. "I am, in fact, Victor Bennett's wife. We've been married for nearly a decade." A collective gasp moved through the audience like wind across a field. Heads turned. Murmurs erupted. Victor slowly stood, his expression a shifting landscape of panic, disbelief, and something else, something close to fear. "I left my family, my country, and my career to be with him," Amara said, her voice unwavering. "I stood beside him through the lean years, when his suits were not tailored and his name meant little. I believed in him. I supported him, and in return, he has erased me." She looked directly at Victor then, their eyes locking across the room. "He told you I was a housekeeper, that he brought me here out of pity, that I'm no one." Victor took a step forward. "Amara, please." But she held up a hand and he stopped. "I won't take any more of your evening," she said, turning back to the audience. "But I won't let this lie live a second longer. I'm not invisible, and I will not be treated as such." She stepped down from the stage, the applause beginning slowly, uncertainly. A few people stood, then more. Some clapped out of respect, some out of shame, some out of sheer disbelief. Victor stood motionless, his hands clenched at his sides. Amara walked past him without a word, without a glance. She moved through the crowd as it parted for her posture unshaken, her steps steady. She exited the ballroom, the noise of the gala falling away behind her like distant thunder. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling in long, deliberate waves. A car passed in the street. Somewhere nearby, a couple laughed. The city continued, unaware, unconcerned. Victor did not follow her. Inside, the gala never fully recovered. The energy shifted, conversations turned, eyes darted toward Victor. The senior executives whispered among themselves. The PR manager's phone buzzed with incoming alerts. The illusion had shattered, and there was no repairing it. Later that night, Victor sat alone in the empty ballroom, his drink untouched, the tables around him cleared. He stared at the stage where Amara had stood, where his mask had been ripped away. He had everything he thought he wanted. And now he realized he had nothing at all. The ballroom was empty by the time Victor finally left. The clinking of glasses and polished laughter had long faded into silence, and now the vast space felt more like a cathedral of failure than a monument to success. The chandeliers still shimmered, the music had ceased, and the only footsteps that echoed across the marble were his own. Outside, the night was cold, the city streets gleamed from the rain, and Victor stood for a long moment beneath the grand awning, staring at the place where Amara had disappeared into the night. His driver, unsure whether to speak, finally opened the door of the waiting car. Victor climbed in without a word. The ride home was a blur. Streetlights flickered against the windows like stuttering memories. His mind replayed her speech again and again, every syllable slicing deeper. Not just the humiliation, though that had been complete and public, but something worse. The realization that the woman he had so carefully pushed aside had become larger than him in the moment she refused to be silent. For years, he had orchestrated every detail of his professional and personal image. He had bent reality to fit the life he wanted. And yet, with a few measured words, Amara had undone it all, not out of vengeance, but with a calm, precise dignity that exposed everything he had become. By the time he reached the apartment, dawn was creeping in. The sky outside the wide living room windows was shifting from black to deep blue, the lights of the city dimming as the first signs of morning appeared. He walked through the silence of the apartment, past the immaculate surfaces, the artfully arranged furniture, the curated sterility of it all. He sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the door, half expecting it to open, but of course it didn't. Amara would not be coming back. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The hours passed slowly, the day beginning without him. Around 9 in the morning, the messages started. First came the polite one from Human Resources, a formal request for a confidential conversation regarding the previous night's incident. Then a text from a junior colleague, hesitant, nervous, unsure whether to express support or distance. Then more emails, more calls. The head of public relations, the executive vice president of regional operations, legal. The company had tried to brand itself as forward-thinking, inclusive, progressive. They celebrated cultural diversity, posted about equity initiatives, invested in inclusive hiring campaigns. What had happened last night was more than a personal scandal. It was a reputational threat. The senior board didn't care about the truth of his marriage. They cared about the optics. About the viral video now circulating online with subtitles, headlines, and hashtags. Executive's wife exposes humiliation at company gala. Senior manager passes off wife as housekeeper. It was everywhere. By the time Victor arrived at the office 2 days later, the mood had shifted. People looked away in the hallways. Conversations quieted when he entered rooms. His assistant, usually cheerful and punctual, avoided eye contact. The meeting with HR was brief but final. He was placed on administrative leave while the company conducted an internal review. He knew what that meant. The investigation was a formality, a way to clear the path for a graceful exit. A resignation under pressure, a mutual agreement. They were giving him the chance to disappear before they made him disappear. That night, he came home to find Amara's side of the closet empty. Her books were gone, the small collection of teas she had kept on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, the scarf she always wore when it rained. There was no note, no message, just absence. A clean, quiet severing. He wandered through the apartment like a stranger, touching the things she had once loved as if they might answer him. But the apartment had never really been hers. She had only made herself fit into it, carefully, respectfully, like someone trying not to disturb the space. And now, even her memory had slipped from the walls. In the following weeks, Victor watched everything unravel. His name became a cautionary tale in industry forums. Former colleagues stopped returning his messages. Invitations ceased. He had built his success on relationships, on the perception of being both competent and cultivated. Now he was radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with him. He submitted a resignation letter before the company could terminate him. The announcement was handled discreetly, but word spread quickly. The story had legs. The press continued to circulate versions of the gala moment, accompanied by think pieces on race, class, and identity. There were interviews with guests who had attended. A few even tried to spin it as a lesson in corporate culture. But Victor knew the truth. He wasn't a parable. He was just a man who had spent years hiding from the one truth he couldn't control. His finances took a hit. Without the corporate salary and bonus structure, the apartment became a burden. Amara's father, who had sent generous checks every few months in quiet support of his daughter's marriage, ceased all communication. Victor realized, to his own shame, how much of his lifestyle had been underwritten by that support. Not directly, not openly, but in small, consistent ways. Gifts, business introductions, discreet assistance. Now, with that lifeline gone, the foundation of his life collapsed. He sold the apartment within a month. The luxury car was next. He moved into a smaller, older rental on the edge of the city, a place with peel-in paint and faulty plumbing. He applied for jobs, initially still clinging to the assumption that his reputation could recover. But each interview ended in polite deflection, or worse, silence. His name triggered uncomfortable memories. No one wanted a scandal-scarred executive on their team, no matter how good his numbers had once been. Amara, meanwhile, had vanished from his daily reality. He didn't know where she had gone. He thought about reaching out, but the silence between them was too wide, too deep. He suspected she had returned to her family, but even that he couldn't confirm. All he had were echoes, an empty closet, a closed door, the words she had spoken on stage that continued to reverberate in his head. Weeks became months. His savings dwindled. He took freelance work where he could find it, consulting on small projects for companies that didn't care about the headlines. He dressed in older suits, commuted by bus, learned to cook for himself. At night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, haunted by her voice. He saw her once, briefly, in an article someone had shared online. It was a photo from a public lecture at a university overseas. She stood on stage, poised, smiling, surrounded by students. The caption referred to her as an international advocate for racial equity and migrant rights. She looked radiant, confident, whole. In that single image, Victor saw everything he had tried to suppress, everything he had diminished. And he knew without bitterness that she was finally where she belonged, free of him. By the end of the year, Victor had become a man unrecognizable to those who had once praised him. He no longer spoke in polished sound bites. He no longer hosted strategy dinners or traveled for networking events. His world had shrunk to a small, modest existence defined by necessity, not ambition. There were days he resented it, days he longed for the gloss of his former life. But there were other days, too, quiet days, when he understood the price he had paid not just for the lie, but for the years he had spent believing that image mattered more than truth. And in those moments he thought of Amara, not with regret, not even with apology, but with the aching knowledge that he had once been loved fully, and had thrown it away not for something real, but for something hollow. He never spoke her name aloud again. but it lived in his silence, in the space where pride had once been. The small plane touched down on the sunlit tarmac of an airport far from the city Victor had once called home. The air was warm and dry, fragrant with distant eucalyptus and dust stirred by the breeze. In the arrivals terminal, Amara stepped out into the open light, wearing a simple cotton dress and flat shoes, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The weight she had carried for years no longer hung on her frame. She was tired, yes, tired in the way one is after a long journey, but underneath that fatigue was something solid. Resolve, clarity, the quiet strength of someone who had survived. Her brother was waiting for her at the gate. He didn't speak when he saw her, only opened his arms, and she folded into them with a sigh, resting her forehead against his shoulder. It had been nearly 10 years since she had last seen him in person. Now, standing together, they didn't need words to close the gap time had created. Love, between siblings, can sometimes mend itself in a single embrace. The ride home took them through wide roads lined with jacaranda trees, their violet blossoms fluttering in the wind like fragments of an old memory. The streets were familiar and unfamiliar all at once. So much had changed, yet the essence of the place remained. Children played barefoot on sidewalks. Music drifted from open doorways. The air was thick with spice and sun. Amara looked out the window, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the seat, her eyes taking in everything with a quiet hunger. Her family home, once grand and full of noise, now felt more modest. Her father, long since retired from his diplomatic post, had taken to gardening, and the once pristine lawn now bore signs of his experimentation. There were beds of herbs, rows of tomatoes, and a stubborn fig tree he had been coaxing into bloom. He met her at the gate, older and slower than she remembered, but still proud, still upright. He didn't speak of Victor, nor of the scandal that had followed. He only kissed her forehead and said, "Welcome home, my daughter." Inside the house, little had changed. The same oil paintings lined the walls, the same mahogany table stood in the dining room. Her mother's absence was felt keenly. Gone now 5 years, but the softness of her presence lingered in the cushions she had embroidered, the recipes she had written in pencil on fading paper. Amara sat on the veranda that night, sipping tea and watching the stars emerge. There were no sirens here, no looming towers of steel, no filtered city lights, only sky, wide, open, ancient. In the days that followed, Amara allowed herself to rest, to sleep without fear, to wake without dread. She walked barefoot through the garden in the mornings, read books beneath the shade of the mango tree, sat with her father over long, quiet lunches. Slowly, her mind began to unwind from the tight coil it had been in for years. The pressure to explain herself, to justify her choices, to defend her worth, it fell away like dead skin. But Amara had never been one to stay still for long. After 2 weeks, she visited the local university, a place she had once dreamed of teaching at before her life took its turn. The campus dean, an old family friend, welcomed her with warmth and curiosity. They spoke at length about her experiences abroad, about her background in law and cultural policy, about the work she had done in silence, papers she had written but never published, thoughts she had long suppressed. By the end of their conversation, the dean offered her a position, guest lecturer for a course on migration and identity. She accepted. It began with 2 lectures a week, but soon grew. Students responded to her voice, not just the content of her words, but the calm, steady conviction with which she delivered them. She spoke of belonging, of the quiet violence of erasure, of how dignity can be both weapon and wound. The students listened. They asked questions. They stayed after class to talk. For the first time in years, Amara felt herself not shrinking to fit into a space, but expanding to fill it. She began writing again. Essays, articles, reflections. A local journal published one, then another. Her name began to circulate among academic and activist circles. She was invited to conferences, asked to sit on panels, consulted on projects. One evening, after delivering a keynote address on systemic bias in global institutions, she was approached by a man named Richard. He was a regional director for a development agency, articulate and thoughtful, with the gentle confidence of someone who listened more than he spoke. Their first conversation was brief, but something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or a recognition. They met again weeks later at a fundraiser. This time they sat and talked for hours. There was no need for performances. Amara spoke openly of her past, and Richard listened without interruption or pity. He told her of his own journey, of losing a sister to war, of choosing to stay and build when others left. They were not the same, but their differences were bridges, not walls. Months passed, and their connection deepened. Where Victor had once demanded silence, Richard invited voice. Where Victor had required control, Richard offered presence. Amara found herself laughing more, worrying less. The shadows of her previous life grew lighter, not because they disappeared, but because she no longer carried them alone. They married quietly. A simple ceremony under a canopy of trees, with close friends and family in attendance. No grandeur, no spectacle, only truth. Amara wore a soft cream dress, her hair unbound, her hands steady in Richard's. When they exchanged vows, it was not to complete each other, but to walk alongside one another, freely and fully. Their home was small, but filled with warmth. Books, music, sunlight streaming through open windows. They cooked together, traveled on occasion, worked late into the night on projects they both believed in. When their first child was born, a daughter with Richard's thoughtful eyes and Amara's rich skin, they named her Nyara, meaning brightness in Amara's mother tongue. Motherhood came to Amara like a long-awaited season. She moved through it with patience and wonder, marveling at the tiny life she had brought into the world. Her past did not vanish, but now it had context, shape, a place in the story she would one day tell her daughter. She would not hide it. She would not flinch. She would teach Nyara not to bow for anyone who demanded that she become smaller in order to be loved. A few years later, a second child, a boy named Elias, joined their family. He was curious and bold, always climbing, always asking. He brought noise and chaos to the quiet house, and Amara welcomed it with open arms. Her days were full. Lectures, research, bedtime stories, morning walks, late-night talks with Richard on the veranda. There was no perfection, but there was peace. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, she would think of Victor, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with a distant kind of acceptance. He had been a part of her life, a chapter, a turning point. He had taught her something she might never have learned otherwise, that to be loved only in fragments is not love at all, that any affection which demands disappearance is not worth the price. She did not hate him, but she did not miss him. Once, while driving through the city for a speaking engagement, she saw a man on the side of the road selling candies at a traffic light. His shoulders were hunched, his suit faded. There was something familiar in the shape of him. She looked again, and her heart paused. It was Victor. He hadn't seen her. His eyes were focused on the line of cars, his hands moving automatically. The light turned green, and Richard drove forward. She did not turn to look back. Her hand reached for her daughter's in the back seat, holding it gently. Ahead of them, the road stretched out, long and open. Amara leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and breathed. The past was behind her. The future was hers. And in the soft laughter of her children, in the quiet strength of her marriage, in the work that gave her voice meaning, she had found everything she had once been denied, not as someone's wife, not as someone's secret, but as herself, whole, unhidden, free. The days in Victor's world no longer held form. They did not begin or end with the certainty they once had, but bled into one another like the ink of a cheap newspaper caught in the rain. The rhythm of his life had been reduced to survival. Each morning a dull awakening in a rented room with walls stained by time. Each evening a retreat into the flickering blue of a second-hand television screen. Where once there had been meetings, strategy briefings, private flights, and curated dinners, there was now only routine. Rise, dress in his one remaining suit, head to the corner kiosk where he stored his boxes of cheap candies and gum, and then stand for hours at a traffic light, approaching drivers with polite gestures and forced smiles. His shoes had begun to wear thin. The soles flapped slightly when he walked, though he had glued them 3 times already. His once pristine shirts were faded at the collar, the cuffs fraying, but pride was a luxury long discarded. Now he took what he could get: small change, a nod of sympathy, the occasional kind word from a stranger. The heat was oppressive in the summer and the rains unforgiving in the spring. Some days he didn't earn enough to cover a proper dinner. On others, he stretched what he had, buying the cheapest bread and a single piece of fruit, eating it slowly, like a ritual. The shame had passed through stages. At first, it had been searing, raw and unbearable, a wound he couldn't touch. Every time he walked into a room, he imagined whispers behind his back, eyes that flickered with recognition. Even in places where no one knew him, he carried the weight of what he had become. Later, it had dulled to something heavier, quieter. It no longer burned, but settled deep in his chest like a stone, unmoved by apology or regret. He tried to look for work in the early days after leaving the city center, applications, calls, walk-ins, but the moment they ran his name, or worse, recognized him, doors closed. Some were polite, some were not. He stopped trying after the 10th rejection. Instead, he accepted that his fall was not temporary. It was permanent, and it was deserved. When he saw himself reflected in the glass of a storefront or the metal of a passing car, he often did not recognize the man staring back. His face had aged rapidly. His once bright hair was tinged with gray, and the tension in his jaw, once a mark of intensity, now seemed simply tired. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, looked like the eyes of a man who had stared too long at a life slipping through his fingers. He lived alone in a single-room unit above a hardware shop. The walls were bare, the floor cracked in places. A rusted fan turned slowly on the ceiling. The landlord was an old man who spoke little and asked only for his rent on time. Victor paid in cash, always 1 week at a time, afraid that any commitment beyond that might break him. There was no internet, no phone line. His cell phone was outdated, used only for calls to the few contacts he had left, none of whom answered anymore. At night, he read old books borrowed from a corner library, not because he wanted to learn, but because the silence was too loud. The words passed through him like wind through an open window. He remembered passages sometimes, stray lines about loss or memory, and they clung to him, more real than his own thoughts. He thought often of Amara, not with bitterness, but with something closer to reverence. She had left him not in anger, but in truth. She had walked away from his lies with a dignity he still couldn't comprehend. And, in doing so, she had reclaimed herself completely. He remembered the way she used to hum while cooking, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when reading, the way she touched his shoulder gently when passing by. He remembered the weight of her absence more than he remembered the weight of her presence. She had been, for so long, the anchor he pretended not to need. Now, unmoored, he drifted in a sea of faces that did not know him, and when they did not care to. One morning, he was setting up his stand at the intersection when a newspaper vendor nearby turned on a small radio. A familiar name pierced the air. Amara's voice followed, crisp and composed, speaking in an interview about a global education initiative. Victor froze. The candy in his hands slipped back into the box. He stood there, listening to the sound of her voice carried through static and city noise, and for a moment, he was back in the kitchen of their old apartment, watching her speak animatedly about the world, about justice, about possibility. He didn't move for a long time after the interview ended. When the light turned green and cars began to roll forward again, he simply sat down on the curb and rested his head in his hands. The vendor, noticing, asked if he was feeling ill. Victor waved him off with a faint smile. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't longing. He knew that part of his life was over, unreachable. It wasn't even regret in the way people normally feel it. It was more like quiet recognition, a reckoning. The knowledge that the woman he had once been ashamed of had become everything he had once hoped to be. That she had not only survived him, but transcended him. She had risen from the ashes of their marriage with wings he had never imagined she possessed. He tried not to dwell on the past too often. It made the days harder. But it returned to him regardless. On rainy afternoons when sales were slow, on nights when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. He would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, imagining how different things might have been if he had chosen differently. If he had spoken her name with pride. If he had defended her in the room instead of hiding her in the shadows. But the past could not be rewritten. It lived behind him like a long shadow, growing longer the more he ran from it. In time, he learned to live with it, to let the weight of his disgrace become part of his breath, his step, his silence. He no longer searched for redemption. That, too, was a luxury he no longer believed he deserved, but he found, in small ways, a kind of penance. He began giving a piece of candy free to every child who passed. He helped an elderly woman carry her groceries one afternoon and checked on her each week after that. He swept the sidewalk in front of his building without being asked. No one noticed. But it didn't matter. He was no longer the man who had needed to be seen. He was simply a man. In the end, what surprised him most was how quiet it all became. The noise of ambition, the clamor of reputation, it faded. What remained was the whisper of mornings and the hush of dusk, the scent of fresh rain on pavement, the smile of a child who hadn't learned to judge yet. These were not victories, but they were moments. And in them he found fragments of the self he had once buried under performance. And when he dreamed, when dreams came at all, they were of open fields, of music playing from a distant window, of a woman with bright eyes and a steady voice who once tried to show him who he could have been, if only he had seen her clearly. The sun was high over the city, casting long ribbons of light across the windshield of passing cars and glinting off the metallic surfaces of street signs, traffic poles and rooftops. The dry wind moved slowly through the lanes, bringing with it the scent of heated asphalt and flowering jacaranda. In the narrow shade of a traffic light, Victor stood, dressed in the same faded trousers and button-down shirt he had worn nearly every day that month. A box of sweets rested on the edge of his wooden cart, neatly arranged, although the wrappers had begun to bleach in the persistent sun. His posture was stooped now, though not from age. He was only in his 40s, but from the slow, daily erosion of something invisible. He walked less briskly than he used to. He no longer looked into the eyes of drivers unless spoken to first. His gaze often settled on the spaces between things, between windows, between people, between then and now. It had been nearly 5 years since the night of the gala. The memory was no longer a vivid wound but a muted scar, familiar and inert. It lingered not as a searing shame, but as a quiet thread woven into every choice he made. The weight of it had grown into him, had become something internal, something lived. In the early months after losing his job, he had waited for things to shift, for the public to forget, for the story to fade from headlines, for the city to give him another chance. But nothing had changed. The silence that followed had been louder than any judgment. His name had disappeared not in scandal, but in disinterest. Now, Victor did not expect anything. He woke, he stood, he sold, and he went home. He had come to accept the rhythm of obscurity. It was not peace, but it was stability of a kind. There was dignity, perhaps, in persistence, and continuing even when no one watched. He was bending to pick up a coin that had rolled beneath the cart when he heard a voice, soft, female, melodic, call his name. It was not the sharp voice of a stranger asking for a price, or the impatient tone of someone short on time. It was quieter, almost hesitant, and yet unmistakably familiar. He straightened slowly, his back stiff, and turned toward the sound. The car was parked just past the light, gleaming beneath the sun. A sleek silver SUV, polished and new, humming softly as its engine idled. Inside, the air conditioning had fogged a portion of the window, but he could see her clearly through the glass. Amara sat behind the wheel, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other turned slightly toward the back seat. Her hair was longer than he remembered, loosely curled, and her skin glowed in the filtered daylight. She wore no heavy makeup, no jewelry of show. Her expression was calm, open. Beside her in the passenger seat sat a little girl, no older than 6, with deep brown skin and curious eyes. A boy, slightly younger, leaned forward from the back, his face partially obscured by a sun hat, holding a picture book in one hand. Victor's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Amara's eyes met his across the narrow distance, and for a moment, time folded. He was no longer the man selling candy beneath the sun. He was no longer a cautionary tale. He was simply a man standing in front of a woman he had once called his wife, once humiliated, once lost. 1,000 thoughts rose inside him, words, apologies, explanations, but none reached his lips. Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything between them had already been said or left unsaid in 100 choices over the years. She did not smile nor frown. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and it held no bitterness. Only knowledge. Only distance. And perhaps, somewhere in the deepest corner of it, something like pity. The light turned green. The car behind her honked gently, not impatiently, but with the kind of rhythm that reminds the world to keep moving. Amara turned her head briefly to check on the road, then back to him. She gave the smallest nod, pressed her foot to the pedal, and the car rolled forward, smooth and certain, vanishing into the current of traffic. Victor remained motionless for a long time. The heat pressed against his skin. His hands hung by his sides. The breeze tugged lightly at the hem of his shirt. Around him, life resumed. Motorcycles whirred past. A man called out to someone across the street. A delivery truck honked twice, and a cyclist veered around him with a muttered complaint. The world, as always, kept moving. He lowered himself slowly onto the concrete ledge beside his cart, legs heavy, hands trembling slightly though he wasn't cold. The image of her remained behind his eyes, clear and sharp. The calm of her face, the assurance in her presence, the way the children had sat peacefully in their seats, surrounded by the warmth of a life built on truth. He did not cry. He hadn't cried in years. Not because the sorrow had passed, but because it had changed form. Tears would have meant something still needed releasing. He had already let go of everything long ago. For the rest of that day, he moved more slowly. He made no effort to sell. When people approached, he handed them candy without charge. He thanked them with quiet nods and returned to his seat. He watched the street, not in hope, but in observation, in the way one watches the tide returning to shore, knowing it will come and go, indifferent to who stands there waiting. Later that evening, as the sky turned to gold, he walked home through the back alleys, taking his time. The streets were filled with children running through puddles left by an earlier rain, their shouts echoing against the walls. The scent of cooking fires drifted through open windows, spiced lentils, stewed tomatoes, grilled meat. He paused once, listening to the muffled sound of a piano from a second-story window. Someone was playing slowly, haltingly, the notes hesitant but sincere. It was not skillful, but it was beautiful in its own way. When he reached his building, he climbed the stairs without rush. His apartment was dim, the fan turning slowly overhead. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his shoes, placing them side by side near the door. Then he reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a faded photograph. It had been taken years ago in a park on a cloudy afternoon. Amara was laughing in the picture, her head tilted slightly back, her hand resting lightly on his arm. There had been no audience that day, no performance. Just sunlight and wind and the sound of her laughter. He placed the photo on the table beside a small glass of water and lit the single candle he kept for power outages. Its flame flickered uncertainly, casting soft shadows against the wall. He watched it for a long time. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. A radio played the same popular tune on repeat. The street vendors began to close for the night, pushing their carts toward home. In another part of the city, Amara would be reading to her children, tucking them in or sitting on the veranda with her husband, sipping tea as they talked about the day. Victor imagined it all, not with jealousy, but with something like awe, that she had made it, not through him, but beyond him. That she had not only survived, but flourished. That she had become the person she was always meant to be. And he, who had once held her hand and walked beside her, had been too afraid to see her for who she was. He had tried to shrink her, to box her into an idea that made him more comfortable, more acceptable, more safe. And, in doing so, he had lost the only thing that had ever made him truly human. The candle flickered again, the flame bending in the soft night air. Victor lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. He would wake again tomorrow. He would stand beneath the same light, sell the same sweets, walk the same road. But tonight, He allowed himself this stillness, this reckoning. The final glance had not broken him. It had finished something, quietly, completely, and that, too, was a kind of peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.